Time for another fairy tale, written by Janny Juddly and read to you by Donna Armstrong. This story is about a little girl called Heidi. She might just as easily have been called Lizzie or Susie, or she could have been a little boy called Johnny or Matthew. But in our story, right now, she's called Heidi. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. There was once a little girl called Heidi. She was a very lucky little girl, because when she was born she was a very beautiful baby, and so everyone fell in love with her. The midwives who helped deliver her, the nurses on the ward, the other visitors, her mummy and daddy, most of all, her mummy and daddy. Her mummy and daddy were so proud of Heidi they couldn't wait to show her off. They were just so excited at what they had managed to produce. She was so perfect, and they loved her because she was so perfect. As Heidi grew up, she became ever more beautiful. Friends of her mummy would tell her that they could eat her, and friends of her daddy told her she would break lots of hearts one day. Heidi didn't really like the idea of breaking people's hearts, and pondered on that a great deal. She didn't feel too comfortable about being eaten either. It felt somehow sort of like being gobbled up like a bowl of jelly and ice cream. It just felt a bit weird inside. Not quite safe. Yes, not quite safe. As Heidi grew up, her mummy and daddy spared no expense. They dressed her up in the most gorgeous, cutest, prettiest clothes and shoes, grew her hair really long so they could put it into lots of different styles for different looks and different occasions, brought sweet jewelry to go with her outfits, and told her she looked like a princess. Heidi sometimes found it a bit hard to keep up the excitement at all these new and wonderful things. She knew it was ungrateful to not love them, and that it was letting her mummy and daddy down if she didn't do all the twirls and pose and smiling for all the photos they and all their relatives wanted to take. To tell the truth, she was a bit alarmed when men she didn't really know would come up and squeeze her cheeks or blow kisses at her and wink. Once a man raised her hand to his lips to kiss it, and then fell on the floor clutching his heart. She felt really frightened because she thought he was dying, and couldn't understand why her mummy and daddy were laughing. Heidi knew that it was very important to her mummy and daddy that she was beautiful, and that everyone loved her. She became very good at producing a smile on demand, and at saying things she knew other people would find cute and lovable. She knew how very important it was to be lovable. And then one day Heidi discovered that she had grown up. She knew she would be okay in this grown-up world because she knew how to dress beautifully, to be charming, to demonstrate nice manners, to say things that people would find lovable. But then, bit by bit, life started to get a bit more complicated. The things that she had always found worked, the things that made her lovable, didn't always seem to be working anymore. And she realized with a huge pang of fear that there were things she didn't know how to do. It was suddenly really frightening. It didn't seem to be enough to be beautiful. It didn't make people love her. People said things like she was shallow and empty-headed and false. And the most frightening thing of all was that she had absolutely no idea whatsoever what on earth they were talking about. There were people who still seemed to find her lovable and beautiful, a certain kind of men who wanted her in a certain way. They reminded her of the way the men who used to squeeze her cheeks when she was a little girl used to look at her. But although they said they loved her, they never behaved like they did after a while, even though she would smile and say nice things just like she had been taught. Heidi was bewildered and frightened and deeply miserable. Somewhere deep down she too knew that she was shallow. She understood enough of what people meant when they used that word to know that they were right. It meant there wasn't enough to her, that she wasn't enough. It meant she pretended a lot, did and said what she thought people wanted her to do and say, and that if she ever tried to think what she herself thought or felt, she couldn't find out. It wasn't there. There wasn't anything there. This was getting really terrifying. There wasn't anything there. Suddenly, Heidi found herself running. She found she couldn't run fast enough or far enough in her heels, so she pulled them off one at a time and ran barefoot instead. And suddenly the busy street she had been running along in her high heels faded away, seemed to merge into something else, and she realized that she was running barefoot on grass. And then the light seemed to fade, the world grew dimmer, and she was running through trees, denser and denser, until she found herself in the middle of a forest. She allowed herself to slow to a walk, and began picking her way more carefully through the undergrowth. Finally she sat down on a fallen tree trunk, put her face in her hands, and sobbed and sobbed. She sobbed like she would never stop, loud, desperate sobs that built up over a whole lifetime kind of sobs. She thought she would never be all cried out. But when at last the sobbing began to ease, and turned finally to caught breaths and sniffles, she was surprised to see, on looking up, a man sitting on a boulder opposite her, with his back against a tree. She was startled to see him, and half made to get up and run some more, but there was something in the gentle gesture of his hand, raised slightly in a soothing wave, that said, "Please stay," and the warmth of deep kindness and concern in his eyes as they held hers, that made her sit down again. Heidi was aware of a strange stillness, a peacefulness, a sense that it was safe here. She looked at the man, old and bearded, dressed in a long plain garment, belted at the waist with rope. She could sense his kindness, his patience, his steadiness. He wasn't like any man she had ever met before. He was wise, knowing. So the old man spoke. He seemed to be waiting for her to speak. She had no idea what he wanted her to say. She was used to knowing what people wanted her to say, but this wasn't like that. "I don't know what you want me to say," she eventually murmured. The wise old man nodded, slowly and clearly understood. He nodded again, and waited. Heidi knew that there was nothing to be rushed here. She looked at him, and his eyes held hers. It was such a strange feeling, a first ever felt feeling, like he could see right into her. She felt the terror grip suddenly. She had forgotten for one moment the awful truth. But he would see. He would know. Just like everyone else, he would see that there was nothing there. When he looked inside, he would see. "Don't look at me!" she burst out. "You mustn't look at me!" The old man looked at the ground briefly. She sensed he didn't want to shame her or make her feel stupid. But when he looked back up, she was shocked to see that there were tears glistening in his eyes. She didn't understand. Why would he be in tears? What had she said to upset him? Had she hurt his feelings? The old man smiled at her, and then spoke. "My child," he said. Heidi was puzzled. Why had he called her that? Again he said, "My child." It was a mixture of recognition and sorrow. "Don't you know who you are?" It was such a strange question, so totally not expected. Why would he ask her that? Of course she knew who she was. She started to tell him, but he held up his hand again, laid his fingers against his lips, and then he met her eyes and held them for so long that she found herself holding her breath from the intensity of it before he said quietly, "I mean, don't you know who you really are? Would you like me to show you?" "I think so," Heidi breathed. She knew this was huge, momentous, a little scary, but really important. From the pocket of his gown, the old man drew out a mirror. He offered it to her. She hesitated for a moment. She had looked in so many mirrors. But then she took it. She looked at herself, her face grubby, her hair a mess, her dress a bit torn from running through the forest. "I look terrible," she said. The old man looked very serious, earnest. "May I hold the mirror for you?" he asked. She handed it to him, and he did a strange thing. He took a deep breath and then breathed onto the mirror. Actually, it seemed more like into the mirror, because his breath had somehow disturbed the mirror's surface. As he held it and she looked, the mist began to clear, and what she saw made her gasp. She shot a look at the old man and saw that his expression was steady and grave. He nodded encouragement, and she looked back into the mirror. The face which looked back at her was extraordinarily beautiful. It was radiant, incandescent, translucent almost. It was composed of almost blinding white light, shimmering and sparkling. It was utterly, breathtakingly beautiful. She looked at the gentle old man for explanation, but instead he pulled from behind the tree a longer, taller mirror. He signaled her to wait where she was, still holding her hand mirror, as he came to stand behind her, and positioned the taller mirror at such an angle that she could see into it through her own mirror. "Now look," he whispered. In the mirror Heidi saw, going on and on and on, for as far back as she could see, other beings, just like the reflection she had seen in her mirror. Each one was looking at her and smiling, like they knew her, like she was known and precious to them. And as she looked, she felt the most amazing heat, like a blanket surrounding her. It was like having countless loving arms wrapped around her. She wanted to say so much. She wanted to say that she didn't feel hollow any more, and that she didn't feel like she wasn't enough any more. There was so much she wanted to say to this strange, kindly old man who had shown her this. She turned to tell him, to try to find the words, but couldn't see him. Then, as she looked back into the mirror, she saw him, right at the back, no longer wearing the old robe and long beard, but glistening and sparkling like sunshine on water, radiating light over them all. And then, as she watched, the mirror misted over and became solid once more, and she was alone in the forest. She sat for a very long time, and it was almost dusk when she decided she would go back. She felt bereft of the old man who had shown her such kindness and wonders, but she no longer felt empty or hollow. Instead, she felt a certainty and depth, almost a sense of meaning she had never known before. As she got up to leave, she heard the tinkling of bells, and the wind whispered in her ear, "Always remember." And she always did. Written by Janny Juddly.